Amina was halfway down the dusty alley, the red earth dark with last night's rain squishing under her sandals, when the stranger at the water point asked, without ceremony, if she could carry a jerrycan to the hospital for him right away. If she did not, the landlord would put the little ones and her meager possessions out on the street by dawn. Why would anyone with a clean shirt and a quiet voice bother to ask an orphan girl to run such a dangerous errand? And why would he press a crumpled naira note into her fist when his car smelled faintly of leather and diesel? She looked up and saw a faintly gleaming watch at his wrist and a glint of patience in his eyes that did not fit the faces of the rich who usually drove past in danfos and big cars. Something about him made her think of stories Auntie told of hidden kings and sudden fortune. The stakes were raw and immediate, rent or the children sleeping under the church awning. And Amina took the jerrycan, not knowing that the quietness in his manner hid a secret that would change everything in ways she could not yet imagine. Amina's ordinary world moved with the rhythm of the market. The chorus of market women calling prices, the distant blare of a danfo horn on the Ijisha road, and the generator hums that stitched themselves into late afternoons like tired insects. Orphaned at 12, she ran a tiny stall of sachet water and plantain near the mosque courtyard, sending any extra coins home to her two cousins, Sadeh and little Emeka, who slept in a corrugated lean-to behind Mrs. Iyabo's compound. She prized honesty, a reputation earned the hard way, and the kind of steady courage that stopped her from selling her dignity for fast money. The red earth, after rain, smelled of pepper and promise, and Amina kept a little notebook where she wrote the names of those who had been kind to her so she could sleep at night believin'. Debts of gratitude balanced the world. Every morning she prayed in the dusty light, counting the days left to pay the landlord, and the sound of the mosque's small bell tightened her chest with the clock of urgency. The inciting incident hit like a folded letter at dawn. A strip of paper from the landlord nailed to the courtyard fence said, 3 days to vacate, because the new owner wanted the lot for a parking lot and he would not accept stories or mercy. Amina's stomach hollowed when Sadeh, clutching a tattered mosquito net, whispered that the school would take her brother Emeka's place if school fees were not paid by Monday. The market keeper, Mr. Olu, said bluntly that he could no longer extend her credit after the sachet supplier hiked prices. As she moved through the bustle, clutching the stranger's jerrycan, the weight of it wobbling like a small law, a black Mercedes eased by. The stranger tucked a card back into his wallet and watched her cross without speaking, the window reflecting her own dusty face and the hint of a name she could not read. She felt watched and strangely protected and terrified. When the man disappeared into a row of hedges, a new tension clenched her chest. The first trial came that afternoon when Mama Titi, the woman who ran the neighborhood water kiosk and who always wore too much perfume and a smile like a promise, offered Amina a place to sell her sachets from the kiosk for a week. No rent, but a small commission, because Mama Titi said she was impressed with Amina's honesty. Amina felt relief like a breeze across the harmattan breath of the market. She handed over her day's coins and later that night discovered with a cold shock that the coins were gone, and Mama Titi's kiosk was shuttered with a lock she had borrowed for repairs, leaving no way for Amina to access what she believed was hers. She rode the danfo home, clutching the wet jerrycan, thinking of Emeka's cough growing worse in the night and wondering if she should have refused Mama Titi's help. And the thought stuck like burrs in her mind. Who did Mama Titi answer to when she smiled so wide? The sting of betrayal made her look again at the stretch of road where she'd seen the Mercedes, and she wondered if the quiet stranger might be the sort of man who noticed when the poor were short-changed. Pattern changed abruptly the next day when a team in suits swept into the neighborhood under the authority of a government permit to clear encroachments, measuring, photographing, and pointing at the same lean-to where Amina's cousins slept. Officials said it was urgent work for a new commercial complex, and the last eviction was only hours away. Amina tried to speak with the lead man, a thin gentleman with a soft voice who dripped compliments like oil. He offered to help her file an appeal for a small fee, which she scraped together from stolen cigarettes and borrowed coins, and he took it with a hand that smelled of eucalyptus and pretense. Behind his rolls of paper, she later overheard a phone call. "Make sure the ICA project goes ahead. We cannot have these people here." And for the first time a name rose in her head, unfamiliar and heavy. Eke, as if the city's new towers wore that name like heraldry. Amina felt fear and curiosity braided together. Who were the men behind the permits? And why would anyone spend hush money on the ears of a poor girl? The end of that same day brought a new blow. The little brother's fever spiked after midnight. The feeble clinic refused service without 300 naira, and the landlord's shadowed footsteps at the gate told her that the eviction would not wait for kindness or prayers. She ran through drenched streets with the memory of the stranger's soft eyes pushing her forward, and sold her last set of plantains to pay the clinic. But when she returned, the landlord had already marked the door with a yellow ribbon, an official seal signaling they would unlock it come dawn. Amina's hands shook as the generator hums of the night market thinned into sleep. She thought of the card the stranger had tucked into his wallet, the way his fingers had fanned like a man used to handling heavy things, and she wondered if he had money, if he could buy them time. The pattern of cruel odds tightened. Mama Titi's theft, the official permit, the fever, each a tightening knot. And Amina lay awake, counting syllables of prayers until the hurt in her chest echoed the neighbor's dog. Then, under a mango tree by the hospital gate, the small seed of kindness was planted in a quiet, very ordinary way. Amina had boiled the last of her water to bring to Emeka when she noticed a stranger sitting on the curb with a cramp in his leg, his suit dusty, his face flat with exhaustion. Without thinking, she sat down cross-legged and poured a cup of water into his palm, saying, "Drink," in the voice she used for children. He took the water with a gentleness that surprised her, his eyes softening as he spoke one sentence. "Thank you." He handed back the cup and placed, unnoticed, a folded bus card on top of her notebook before he walked away toward a black car that smelled faintly of leather and old jasmine. Amina felt a small warmth bloom because she had not kept the water for herself. Although she had no idea why the gesture would ripple into anything larger, she tucked the bus card into her notebook as if it were a charm. Somewhere in the crowd, a man in a dark car watched her kindness and made a note in a tiny squared book. And that quiet observation would matter in ways no one could see yet. The pressure tightened like a vice as the days sprinted. The landlord's 3-day deadline became 2, then 1. The appeal promised by the friendly official still needed processing fees that Amina could not muster. And Emeka's cough deepened into rattling nights where he coughed so violently Amina feared he would suffocate before sunrise. The market seized the rhythm of panic. Suppliers pushed prices. Mama Titi whispered promises, and the danfo horns outside the clinic became the punctuation of time running out. The words, "eviction tomorrow by dawn," turned into a drumbeat in her head. Amina found herself on the courthouse steps waiting for a clerk to file an appeal, her hands clutching the quiet bus card the stranger had left. When the clerk demanded identification, she realized with a cold squeeze that her papers had been taken by someone who promised help. The wolf in sheep's clothing, the soft-voiced official who had smiled so prettily, had vanished with what was hers. Time was a hard blade now. By dawn, they would throw the things into the street, and by noon, the children would belong to no roof at all. At the story's midpoint, a reveal cleaved into Amina's life like a sudden summer storm. The quiet stranger, the man who had accepted her water and left a bus card, was named Tunde Ike. He was not a kindly passerby, but the heir of Ike Industries, one of the largest conglomerates in the country with interests in construction, property, and the very permits that had put the eviction notice on her door. He had been moving in a quiet, private orbit, avoiding the fanfare of his father's empire while apprenticing himself to the city's truth by watching its cracks. When a photograph of Amina, taken by him with her carrying water outside the clinic, appeared on his small private column, the city paused. Tunde stepped forward in a way he never had before, not with the bluster of wealth but with a slow flame of apology and responsibility. When the car doors opened near the courtyard, the whole street turned to see a man whose silence had been a coat for a fortune. The revelation reframed everything. She could be saved with the wealth he possessed, but his presence unearthed new choices about dignity, power, and the price of rescue. Amina's darkest moment came not when Tunde offered money, but when he could not stop what followed. An embittered man, Mr. Olu, the market keeper who had never forgiven her for his own losses, stood in the compound with a small crowd and accused her of stealing from Iki's private office, producing a photograph of her standing at a back door with the jerrycan as if it were proof of theft. The thin, soft-voiced official who had promised help reappeared to call her a nuisance, and the police, uncomfortable and hurried, took her in for questioning while Emeka lay under mosquito netting and fever in the lean-to. Amina felt everything collapse. Humiliation poured like rain, and there was a point where she could have signed a paper to be quiet, to accept hush money, to erase her claim in exchange for safety. The notebook where she kept the names of those kind to her sat open in her bag, an old promise to herself to be honest even when the world offered easier paths. She refused the hush money. She told the truth in a small, steady voice, and that choice, made from the grit that had been with her since childhood, altered how everyone would remember her. The climax played out like a market day turned legal storm. Tunde used the resources he had not to bruise the people who had wronged her so much as to set a clear record. He paid for a local investigator to retrace the paper trail of Mr. Olu and Mama Titi's shifty transactions, exposing that the supposed soft-voiced official had been accepting bribes from land speculators connected to Eek Industries board members who wanted to force cheap buys. The photographs were proved manipulated, and the crowd's roar turned into shame as evidence laid bare who profited from the evictions. On a bright, searing afternoon, beneath the shadow of a newly built Ike Tower, Mr. Olu and the official were publicly named and suspended. The permits were revoked pending transparent review, and a municipal hearing announced immediate interim housing for those marked for eviction. Amina stood at the hearing, her dress still patched, Emeka at her side, and felt a wind of vindication that tasted of dust and rain and something like justice. The men who had leveraged the poor into absence felt consequence fall on them like a gavel. After the public reckoning, the new normal unfurled in concrete ways. Tunde did not buy them a mansion, nor did he take Amina away from her life. Instead, he invested in a community water borehole and a small grant for women like Amina to run cooperatives, and he worked with local leaders to secure school fees and a small lease for a proper stall with a lock so the market would no longer be prey to quick thieves. Amina used the grant to rent out a 2-room brick structure by the paved road where the harmattan was gentler and the danfo horns less ominous, and she opened a water kiosk that pumped clean water, the generator hum replaced by the steady, soothing clatter of the borehole. Emeka went back to school, the landlord's notice was rescinded, and Mama Iyabo invited the family for Sunday jollof in a courtyard that now smelled of spices rather than fear. Tunde came sometimes, sitting on the edge of the compound as if to remind himself how ordinary life felt, but he never used his name to buy her gratitude. She learned why the quiet billionaire heir had leaned into her life. Tunde had been raised inside walls of opulence where whole communities were mere line items, and Amina's simple act, offering water without thought of return, had been a mirror he could not look away from, making him see the human faces his father's ledgers had flattened. The choice he made to reveal himself was not to rescue her as a charity case, but to dismantle a system that used wealth to displace and silence, and Amina's refusal to take an easy hush-money deal forced the truth into daylight. On a street where danfo horns still cried and the red earth still tracked shoe soles, the sight of a borehole in the square and children lined for school turned into visible proof that small kindnesses matched with responsibility could shift power. In the end, the name of the secret was spoken aloud. Tunde Ike, the quiet heir to Ike Industries, had watched an orphan girl carry water for a stranger and realized that the smallest acts were the most telling of character. He chose to act not as a savior, but as a steward who corrected harm his world had helped to create. The why was simple and sharp, because he had seen Amina choose dignity over a bribe, because he could not bear to have his family's fortune used to silence and scatter the people who fed the city, and because sometimes a witness with resources must become an instrument of repair. The reaction on screen was unmistakable. The boardroom trembled, the corrupt officials were named, and the marketplace celebrated as a community center was built where the bulldozers had been scheduled. Justice arrived methodically, not miraculously, and the consequence landed in plain sight on those who had abused power. Kindness, the story quietly insists, is not a currency to be spent once. It is a seed that can change the soil it falls upon when tended by people who remember names and faces. Truth, when held steady by courage, will cut through the platitudes of soft-voiced promises and expose who profits from poverty. Dignity does not keep you poor, it keeps you human. Never judge a life by one chapter. A girl carrying water at a hospital gate can change a man who wears a quiet fortune into someone who fixes the very structures that made her struggle. If this tale moved you, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Who do you know that carried someone else's water, or who surprised you by doing the right thing? If you'd like more modern African folktales with heart and a twist, subscribe, like, and turn on notifications so the next story finds you. Thank you for listening, and come back soon for another story beneath the red earth and the humming generators. Dawn pressed in over the courthouse yard like a shy hand pressing a hard truth, and the makeshift stage where evictions and recoveries would be decided buzzed with the buzz of the city. The market women already arguing prices softly in the background, the boreholes hiss near the corner, the danfos sighing in, and the notes of a distant talking drum echoing a rhythm of beginnings. Amina stood with Emeka tucked close, his fever dreams stuttering behind his eyes, as if the day itself might slip away if he coughed too loudly. Tunde appeared at the edge of the crowd with a calm that felt almost tethered to gravity, a lawyer at his side, and a reporter's camera catching every tremor in the air. The interim housing banner fluttered above the steps like a banner of mercy and a warning. The clerk announced a recess to gather more filings, and when Amina's name came up to testify, her breath hitched, only to be steadied by Emeka's small hand gripping hers. She told the truth as if she were slicing through a stubborn thorn with a steady hinge of honesty, that she had carried water for a stranger not to steal from the city or to buy silence, but to keep her brother alive long enough for a school to become a doorway rather than a barrier. Her words rose. The crowd's murmur shifted from sympathy to curiosity to resolve. The soft-voiced official, whose charm had once nearly bought her quiet, slid a glance at Tunde and then away. In that moment, the billionaire heir, previously a silent wind behind the trees, stepped into the light with a temperate, measured certainty that surprised everyone who had learned to fear wealth as a weapon. "This is not a charity case," he said, voice clear but unshowy. "This is a citizen's fight for air and a child's future." The crowd shifted as though a single breath had turned a corner because they could see something in his eyes they had not expected. A man who could have bought silence but chose to purchase accountability instead. Act 2. Engine began in earnest when a cascade of small, stubborn truths started tumbling into the air like pebbles loosened by rain. A ring of real estate frontmen whose names were printed on more than one signed sheet. The bribes hidden in envelopes marked with a seal of a mutual interest. The photograph that had been used to frame Amina as a thief, now proven a doctored forgery when a quiet, sharp-eyed city auditor testified that the original image had been manipulated and that the back door she stood by had never been a place of malice, only the alley through which she had once carried her water. The hearing room, once a hush of whispers and skeptical glances, turned into a courtroom of moral weight where the air smelled of rain-stained concrete and possibility. Amina, steadier than the tremor in Emeka's cough, listened to Tunda lay out a plan that did not hail from a boardroom alone, but sprang from street-level needs. "We will fund the interim housing," he announced, "and we will set up a small, transparent fund for widows, single parents, and kids who need a hand to stay in school. We will audit the permits, and we will publish every line of the paper trail so the city learns to hold power accountable." The room exhaled as if a heavy curtain had finally been drawn back from the sun, and the crowd, once a chorus of judgment and fear, became a chorus of witnesses murmuring, "Let the truth stand." But the clock kept its brutal rhythm, and the clock whispered that time mattered more than mood. The eviction orders still stood to be paused, the paperwork still needed to be filed, and the city's chewing gum wheels of bureaucracy could still grind down the best of intentions if not kept in motion by consequence. The first micro-cliffhanger arrived as a late afternoon gust stirred the plastic chairs and the crowd began to drift toward the corridor outside the hearing hall. A junior investigator, quiet, unassuming, pressed a folded document into Tunda's hand, a trail of names written in a handwriting that matched nothing the public had seen before, and he whispered, "Photographs you thought were solid? They're the same ones used to seed the first eviction, but the metadata reveals the dates were swapped to align with market whims." Tunde pocketed the note with a nod and a frown that tightened his jaw, and Amina, who had learned to read 1,000 expressions in a single blink, found in that moment a new ally. A man who did not want to win a battle by wearing a crown of headlines, but by undoing the harm the headlines had caused. Midway through the paragraph, the turning point landed like a drumbeat that announced a second, more personal reckoning. The evidence began to connect the dots not only to the soft-voiced official and to Mr. Olu, but to a subtle, almost invisible chain. Owners of a parking lot project assigned to cover the old market, who stood to gain from replacing the courtyard with glass and steel, a plan that would push the poor further out of sight. As the court's microphones picked up the whispers of names long tucked into board books, names that looked like fortune, but in truth were fear made concrete, Tunda stepped closer to Amina, his presence not to claim credit, but to share the risk and responsibility. "If we win this," he said, almost in a tone you would use to tell a child a bedtime story that ends well, "we win together, and we stay awake together." Amina replied with a quiet but certain "yes," that carried with it the memory of every cough Emeka had fought off with water and courage, and the crowd's attention sharpened as if the city itself leaned in to stand to a vow that felt possible for the first time in a long while. Emeka, eyes bright enough to steal the shade from the room, whispered a soft, "Mama," and held on to his sister as if to remind both their hearts where home lived. As the hearing's walls seemed to tilt toward justice, a concrete promise finally began to emit a steady, audible glow. The interim housing would be secured, the borehole would be funded as a public good, the small stall market, protected by a lease and a lock, would become a community hub where women could run micro-enterprises without fear of eviction, and most importantly, Amina's name would be spoken openly among the city's reformers. A girl who had once carried water for a stranger now standing as the emblem of resilience and moral force. The payoff arrived not as a single fireworks burst, but as a series of practical steps that felt, to the neighborhood, like a very old story finally catching its rightful turn. A new cage of safety around Emeka's feverish nights, a brighter classroom window for Sade's late-night homework, a stable stall for Amina's sachets that did not require her to lay dignity aside, and a city ledger that could no longer be blind to the need that had always stood under the mango tree by the hospital gate. When the decision finally rolled out, it did so with a public apology from the previous men who had claimed to lead with mercy, but had behaved like rulers of a shadow world. The apology was not puffed up, but simple and clear, and it carried with it the weight of restitution, compensation for Mama Titi's theft, a renewal of Iyabo's courtyard for Sunday meals, and a real lease, no longer a dream, on the two-room brick house that Amina claimed as home and as a beacon for others. The healing, however, was not complete, and the story left a single thread untied for future hearings, the possibility that this victory would invite new investors who would test the balance between public good and private gain, and the city's next chapter would demand that the people who fed it, Amina, Emeka, Sade, and the neighbors, stand guard against a new wave of quiet attempts to buy their future. By the time the sun slid behind the office towers and the danfo horns softened into a distant ring, the city's ground rules had shifted from fear to a shared belief in responsibility, and Amina found herself learning a new form of courage, to speak less for herself and more for those who could not yet voice their needs without fear. She taught Emeka to read not just his school books, but the way the city's power moved, how the borehole's thrum replaced the generator's iron voice, how the market stalls could become a classroom, how a quiet donor's money could be turned into a living, breathing system that valued every child's fee-paid future as something worth fighting for, not something to be bought away. The last scene of this chapter showed Tunde stepping into the crowd, not to stand apart as patron, but to stand with as a partner, and Amina, glancing at the folded bus card she kept as a talisman, understood that the interval beat, the reveal of his secret wealth and his willingness to use it to mend rather than to own, had become a vow she could measure against the city's heartbeat. The story closed with a breath of new beginnings blowing through the mango tree's shade by the hospital gate, where children waited for clean water and stories, and where a girl who carried water for kindness had become a witness to a different kind of wealth, the kind that multiplies when it is shared, restored, and held accountable. The next chapter's questions rose like heat on a dry road. Who would test this fragile piece next, and what price would be asked to keep the ground steady under the city's feet? The interval beat had ended, and a hush fell over the courthouse yard as the sun threw long shadows across the marble steps. The crowd, which had learned to move with the cadence of fear and hope, held its breath for what would come next. Amina's name repeated in a voice that trembled only for a heartbeat. Emeka clinging to her side with a feverish stubbornness, and Tunde standing not as savior, but as steward, his sleeves rolled, a plan already taking shape in the quiet arithmetic of promises and consequences. The first concrete move arrived in the form of a compact, unflashy sheet of paper that the clerk slid to Tunde mid-muzzled applause. A timeline for interim housing, a fund for women like Amina to nurture micro-enterprises, and a transparent audit that would shine a light on every permit and every backroom deal that had once kept the poor in their place. Amina touched the cold edge of the clipboard as if it were a talisman, her voice steadier than she felt. "We will use this to feed Emeka's future, and Sade's studies, and Iyabo's courtyard meals, not to fuel someone's vanity." The crowd exhaled as one, and a wave of relief moved through them, an answer to the hunger that had gnawed at their ribs for months, a sense that the city could be counted on to keep a record of mercy when mercy would otherwise vanish into a parking lot's quiet gray. Yet even as the first seeds of the new order took root, a different kind of wind stirred. a junior investigator's note found its way to Tunda's hand, hidden in the folds of a docket, a folded photograph with a date stamp that did not match the scene it claimed to document, and the investigator's whispered warning. The dates were swapped to cover a trail, left a chill that traveled from the soles of Amina's sandals to the crown of the tallest tower in the city, reminding everyone that in a city where wealth can dilute truth, victory has a shadow. The next beat of the engine came soon after as the hearing room emptied into a corridor jammed with reporters and neighbors who wanted to witness not just a settlement, but a meaningful shift. The soft-voiced official, who had once flashed a smile like a key to a closed door, paused to ask Amina, "You spoke truth in a language even the powerful must hear. Will you help us train other young people in that same language?" She nodded, not with bravado, but with the patient gravity she had practiced since childhood, and in that moment she understood that her life would not be measured by the number of coins she could pocket, but by the number of doors she could open for the quiet ones who slept under the church awning and prayed for mornings when the rain would wash away fear as surely as it washed the red dust from their feet. Micro cliffhangers began in earnest as the day wore on. First, the junior investigator handed Tunde a second document, a chain of emails and meeting notes tied to a parking lot project that would literally reshape the market into a glass-front boulevard. The words "mutual interests" dancing around signatures that looked innocent but smelled of power. Then, a discreet meeting between Iyabo and Sade backstage at the courtyard, where they whispered about a scholarship fund that would lift Emeka into a classroom with desks and chalk instead of a mosquito net and a cracked wall, and a promise that the new lease would be protected by a public ledger visible to all, not hidden in a safe whose combination only a few could memorize. The air tasted of rain and coffee and the sharp sting of fear tempered by courage, and the crowd began to whisper the name of a new ally who did not arrive with a thunderclap, but with the soft, precise click of a key unlocking a door that had been sealed by silence for far too long. Midway into the paragraph, the turning point lands with surprising clarity. The hidden twist that makes this fight neither a charity case nor a single scandal, but a system-wide rebalancing, arrives when a second, more personal truth is revealed, not in bold headlines, but in the quiet, almost shy courage of a man who could have walked away with a trophy, but chose to walk into the line of wind instead. The interval beat that reappears is not merely the public acknowledgement of Tunde's wealth or Amina's integrity, but the acknowledgement of a second actor who had watched from the edges and finally steps forward. The same city auditor who took the stand to testify against doctored photographs now reveals a second thread. The very metadata that had pointed to swapped dates also carried an imprint of a private donor's name who had quietly funded the initial eviction plan. A donor who stands at the top of a corporate ladder that no one in the crowd would mistake for merely generous. A donor whose currency is influence and whose lobby is silence. The room tilts at the revelation. Faces that had looked weary 2 hours earlier suddenly sharpen with new intent, and Amina, who has learned to measure a man by what he risks as well as what he gives, senses that the fight is no longer about one eviction or one plot of land, but about who owns the memory of a city and who is brave enough to rewrite it. The turning point comes when Tunde, listening to the auditor speak with careful restraint, does not reach for a victory pose, but for a binding plan. He proposes a community governance board that includes several market women, a student representative from Emeka's future class, a rotating council of elders, and an evidence desk where every permit, every payment, and every signature would be logged and made accessible to the people. He looks at Amina with a steadiness that seems almost new to him, and he says, "If we are to change the air here, we must stop pretending that wealth erases harm and start proving that accountability is not a punishment, but a promise kept." Amina's eyes fill with the kind of quiet tears that mean someone has finally been seen. Not pitied, not pitied for, but truly recognized as a person who could help hold a city together with the strength of a sister's hand and a brother's belief. Emeka, sensing the gravity of it all, presses his small forehead to his sister's, and in that touch there is a vow as old as the mango tree. I will learn, I will grow, and I will not forget where I came from. The next layer of the narrative unfolds with a careful, almost ceremonial pace. The city agrees to pause the eviction orders pending the board's formation. The interim housing settles into real, breathable spaces with doors that lock and windows that catch the light, and the borehole begins to hum with a clean, steady breath that pushes the scent of fear out of the courtyard. The money that once slid through the market like a sly trickle becomes a transparent grant that reaches Amina's new two-room brick home, where a small desk appears and a chalkboard goes up near Emeka's corner, and Sadi's eyes gleam as she imagines becoming the first girl in her family to finish secondary school. The community's mood shifts from suspicion to cautious pride. Mama Titi, who once wore perfume like a badge of easy praise, now sits at Iyabo's courtyard with a notebook and a plan to convert her own kiosk into a cooperative stall where women can trade goods without fear of a lock and key that feels like a chain. The city's wealth gap cues echo across the page. The glass towers remain, the dusty market remains, but a new rhythm carves a line between the two that everyone can hear if they listen. The generator's low thrum outside the hospital gate gives way to the borehole's even song. The danfo horns become a chorus that celebrates resilience rather than scorns poverty. And a justice that is not loud but durable begins to take root in the soil where Amina plants a small herb garden to remind Emeka that health begins with simple things like clean water and a chance to breathe. The end of this segment arrives with a visible consequence that can be touched and counted. The foundation is launched in a ceremony that looks less like a gala and more like a neighborhood parade, with Amina cutting a ribbon of rather humble cloth, while Emeka's cough declines for the first time in weeks. Sade stay, hopping forward to say a few earnest words about the importance of education, and Iyabo's courtyard filled with neighbors who share stories, and a pot of soup that tastes of forgiveness. The hidden wealth gap remains in the background as a constant test. The real estate brokers who still circle like hawks, the parking lot project's generals who now face a board that would not bow to their every whim, and the quiet donor who has learned that visibility is a double-edged blade. But the consequence is clear. The city has shifted, not by a single miracle, but by a mosaic of small, stubborn acts that refuse to be erased. One thread, though, is still dangling in the air. A whispered rumor that the very person who first fed Amina's suspicion about a cover story, the donor behind the initial eviction plan, has sent a message through a back channel offering a quiet alternative that would preserve a portion of the old order if they would merely keep quiet about the rest. The moment's tension hums just beneath the surface, a reminder that power never truly retires, only hides in a new desk under a new name. The closing beat lands with a soft, almost admiring twist. The interval's echo returns as a choice that Amina makes not for herself, but for the city's future, whether to let the last, deeper bargain go, or to demand that even the smallest exchange be exposed to public daylight, and she chooses exposure and accountability again, knowing that every honest step might invite another test, another temptation, but also another chance to prove that kindness multiplied by courage is a force stronger than fear. The final cadence of this installment lands on a luminous note that is both a finish and a doorway, a modest ceremony that marks the dawn of a new normal. Amina's two-room house, now a tiny, well-kept hub where charts and ledgers rest on a wobbly table, but the air feels steady, where Emeka's school uniform hangs neat, where Sade's homework sits beside a proud certificate, and where a community notice board carries the day's small victories and tomorrow's plans in bright, legible letters. Yet the last lines carry a careful tremor, a reminder that the story's engine is still warming for the next turn. The donor's letter, printed on heavy paper and sealed with a wax-like emblem, arrives at Tunde's desk, promising continued support with a warning that some improvements may be misinterpreted as charity by those who never learned to count from poverty up to power. A teenager in the crowd who has learned to read both the market's price tags and the ledger's true costs whispers to Amina, "Do not fear to ask the right questions, or the right questions will never be asked of you." As the camera pulls back across the mango tree's shade by the hospital gate, the scene holds a breath. The water that now bubbles cleanly at the kiosk, the laughter of children queuing for a drink, the sound of the borehole's steady hiss, and the distant muffled rhythm of a city learning how to keep its promises. These are not endings, but a hinge, a turning point that invites the next act to rise from the steady ground of honesty, resilience, and shared responsibility. The interval's twist has become a durable truth. Wealth, when allied with accountability and compassion, can be a tool for repair. The next challenge will test whether the city will guard this hard-won balance or let old habits creep back in. In the soft glow of the mango tree's shade, Amina looks toward a horizon where her name is no longer a memory but a beacon, and she asks softly, "Where will we stand when the next question comes?" The last lines, tethered to the future, promise that the next chapter will begin with a new test of trust, a new act of courage, and the quiet certainty that when a girl carries water for kindness, she carries with her the power to move a city toward justice, one honest breath at a time. The interval beats fade, the lights tilt toward a wider frame, and the next film-ready moment waits. We end here with the field of home, the market's pulse, and a boardroom's hush, all coexisting in one breath, ready to unfold in the very next scene.